accounting for Bitcoin. The U.S. Marshals still don't know how much Bitcoin we have. And then two, how we'll secure it once we do know how much Bitcoin we have. So we'll start there, and then we'll delve into the personal privacy stuff as well. As always, I'm going to be Thomas here just to say this is a bar. This is a small sort of atmosphere, and everybody's encouraged to raise their hands. I'm also a former teacher, so I hate being in the front of the room with nobody responding to what I'm saying or to what we're saying up here. Please ask a question for clarification. Don't feel a need to wait toward the end of the interview. Speak up when you have a question. Ask us to clarify something. We'll happily call on you. I think somebody might be running around with a microphone, but it's also a small enough room for me to hear whatever you have to say. I don't know if it matters to anybody. We are recording this both to do a live stream via PubKey's channels. We're also going to be publishing this via the Bitcoin Magazine YouTube channel tomorrow once we do a little color and audio correction. So don't turn around if you don't want to be on camera. I don't know what else to say, but yeah, it'll be on camera. We're recording, and that's about it. Does anybody have any questions? All right. You don't even want to practice your questions yet? All right. Fair enough. All right. Well, I will introduce him in a second, but we are super grateful to have Nick here with us. You can give this guy a round of applause to begin with. We could practice our round of applause. Yeah. All right. And then when I get the cue, we will get going. Is anybody excited about the SBR? Are we not? Are we very cypherpunkish? We don't trust the man, if you will? Yeah. All right. We're ready to go. Okie dokie. Welcome back, everybody. We are here at PubKey. To my left, we have the one and only Nick Neuman, CEO of Casa, Bitcoin security company or crypto security company. And I am Frank Corva. I'm with Bitcoin Magazine. I am their political correspondent and former business correspondent. I had the great privilege of interviewing Nick for a founder's piece that I wrote on him. It was a few months back now. We said that we would get around to doing something like this. And again, I think we sort of lucked out given how timely it is that the SBR is happening and that we have this huge sort of whether you like it or not, monumental event in Bitcoin where the government now views Bitcoin as a strategic asset, something it needs to protect. So let me actually first have you introduce yourself a bit more, if you don't mind, Nick, and then we'll dive into a little bit about how the government might protect the strategic Bitcoin reserve. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, we've done a good amount of interviews lately. We had the business one. Also, my microphone's going in and out. I was blocking the signal. Yes. Okay.
Interesting.
All right. So we had the business one, and then we also had the inauguration day live stream.
Oh, yeah. We did that from right here.
Yeah, right here. That was a bit of a Wild West day.
That's true.
It was fun. Okay, so I'm Nick, and I'm the CEO of Casa, and we've been around since 2018. We help people to self-custody their Bitcoin, and generally from like a very high level of security. So it's always, how do we make sure that people have an approachable way to have as high, the most robust level of security that they can, without it having to feel like you're just going through all of this super technical stuff that you need to know. We kind of guide you every step of the way. So we have been around for 6 years. We're one of the largest securers of Bitcoin in the world, and we control none of it. It's all self-custody held by our customers. So that's the quick detail on me and Casa.
Very cool. Just a show of hands, how many people are familiar with what Casa does? I'm curious. All right, cool. So we have some hopefully some users here as well. But let's dive in with this timely topic of the SBR. So for those who don't know, we're right now waiting on an audit from the U.S. Marshals to know officially how much Bitcoin we have. And then as of right now, I don't think anybody has shared any information about how we're currently not only securing the Bitcoin we have, but the other digital assets. People sort of joke, I don't know if it's a joke, that it's just sort of maybe sitting in a ledger in someone in the U.S. Marshal's desk right now, which is kind of insane to think about.
But I think it's probably like, it's a combo of like many ledgers potentially.
Many ledgers, okay.
Because, well, I think if you think about how they've gotten it so far, they've basically gotten it from seized assets. And so in a criminal case, they, arrest somebody and they find a ledger in their apartment or something, and it's not a strategic asset to the U.S. And so they put that ledger probably in like an evidence bag and then like stick it somewhere. and that's where it stays.
Do they get the seed card with that as well?
I
You
don't
think?
know.
Okay.
I don't know.
So just lots of cards
Yeah.
floating around. Who knows what goes to what? Okay. Well, let's say we magically get all this sorted out. We know how much Bitcoin we have. So let's actually do even higher level. You spoke about this on Tuesday at the Bitcoin Policy Institute's Bitcoin for America talk. You talked with, I think it was Mike Belshie and Nathan McCauley, two people who offer custodial services for Bitcoin. You obviously offer non-custodial services, help people custody their own Bitcoin. You talked about the difference between the two. Should the U.S. use a custodian, or should the U.S. hold its own keys to its Bitcoin? Let's start there.
Well, I think to answer this question, you have to think a little bit about what the government cares about when they're securing a strategic asset. So as of last Wednesday, Bitcoin was kind of just another thing that they had in their drawer. And then as of last Thursday, a day later, suddenly Bitcoin is a strategic asset of the United States. And so when something becomes a strategic asset of the United States, what do they care about? They arguably care about having control over that asset. They care about securing it well and making sure that they can use it to further their ends. And so when you think about, like, break that down into kind of what are the, when you secure it and you want control over it, what are the pieces of that? Well, you want control, which means that you actually have full control over the asset. So take another strategic asset of the US, like the airspace over the United States. The US doesn't like ask United Airlines to secure the airspace over the United States. We've got military air bases all around the country that are ready to send fighter jets out and protect our airspace. You can do that for land, waterways, ports, all of these things. You can also do it look at that for our gold. So we keep our gold in Fort Knox, a little bit beneath the New York Fed, which is here at the south end of Manhattan, and then a couple of other places. And basically the people that protect that are government employees with government resources. It's not like they're outsourcing that to some other kind of company or military group that does all of that, right? So Bitcoin is now a strategic asset of the United States. So they should care about, and I think will care about, the control of that asset. And so one of the things that they did with the executive order, I don't know how many people have read that, but they basically created two things. They created a strategic Bitcoin reserve and a digital asset stockpile. And the digital asset stockpile is not strategic. And they're allowed to sell the digital asset stockpile, but they have to keep they're not allowed to sell the Bitcoin in the strategic reserve. So I think the first fork in the road and decision that they need to make is we hold the keys for the Bitcoin and we use a custodian for everything else. Because everything else is non-strategic, and if something happens to it, well, whatever, like, we don't even have to talk about that.
It was just Solana. That's
yeah,
it.
it was just Solana.
No offense to the Solana maxis here. Yeah, sorry. Isaac, you had a question? Yeah.
Based on that line of thinking, wouldn't that almost be logical for the government to mine Bitcoin? If the idea is that we secure the airspace and we control the seas, wouldn't it be more important to control a certain amount of hash rate?
I'm just going to repeat. I was going to say, yeah, I can repeat the question too. So no, yeah, but he was asking, would it also just make sense for the government just to get into Bitcoin mining the same way you're going to secure, I don't know, the flight networks or your airspace? You're going to secure the hash rate, or you secure the network by contributing to the hash rate to some degree. Did you want to add to it, Isaac? Yeah.
That sums it up.
Cool. Yeah.
I think that is already happening through Proxy, which is basically US-based miners.
Marathon, Riot.
Yeah. But I think it is, this is why the government will, I think, continue to encourage mining and probably ramp up encouragement and forms of incentives to mine in the US, because you basically want a decent amount of hash rate based in the US so that they have better control over making sure that, you know, US Bitcoin transactions can be mined. And I think that there's maybe some parts of the overall security model for the government's Bitcoin that could also be tied to that, but we can kind of get into that deeper rabbit hole later if we have time. But I do think that they will, they're already encouraging US Bitcoin mining. I don't know that we would see the government start mining themselves, but they're going to encourage it through proxy by U.S.-based companies.
I think that's fair. Yeah. Question over here. Yep. I, is it good? Can you hear him all right, Daniel?
Is the switch on the side of it?
Is it glowing?
Okay.
Okay.
Let's assume for a moment that what we have here in the strategic reserve persists across administrations and it becomes a reality that's permanent. Maybe a more appropriate analogy might be the petroleum reserve, the strategic petroleum reserve. And if you think about it that way, its fundamental function is to stabilize the markets, right? How do you feel, just ideologically, about a government reserve stabilizing?
I'm gonna repeat that just so that everybody listening on video can hear. Yeah, so he was saying maybe we conceptualize the Bitcoin reserve more like an oil reserve, which we use to sort of stabilize oil markets, right? How do we feel about that? It's odd that you say that. I was just listening to Laura Shin's podcast on the way here, and she had two people who were at the summit on Friday, and they were talking about it from this exact perspective, buying and selling. I don't know. I think a lot of this will depend on whether or not it just ends up that the executive order is sort of the law of the land as far as the SBR, or whether the Bitcoin Act passes, which says that you actually can't sell any of the Bitcoin for 20 years. So a lot of this will, I think, result or have the effect will be sort of what sort of legislation gets passed and what governs this. We talked a little bit about this, and we'll touch on it too, whether or not we end up using things like time locks and things where the government just literally technologically can't touch the Bitcoin for a certain period of time. I think that's a piece of it. But let me send this question over to you if you don't mind, and then we'll come back here. Conceptualizing the reserve, you touched on this, and I think it's important. A digital Fort Knox is different than a physical Fort Knox. We talked about this a little bit upstairs. Could you talk about, in your mind, what you see as the difference between the two? Because most people are saying, I think Trump himself, both in the EO and at the summit, said, yeah, we're going to have a digital Fort Knox, Bitcoin. Why is it not necessarily the same thing to secure Bitcoin as it is to secure gold?
Yeah. So real quick on your point, I don't think it's like the petroleum reserve. I think it's more like the gold reserve, where it's an asset that is on the government's balance sheet that appreciates over time, or should appreciate over time if the government actually marked up the gold value. But hopefully they will actually mark to market the Bitcoin value. And I think that asset should appreciate over time, which allows us to do more things with the financial balance sheet of the United States, rather than it be like the petroleum reserve, where you're trying to sell Bitcoin to sell or buy Bitcoin to change volatility. I think it's because it's a financial asset rather than being a utility asset. I think that's why it's a little bit different. Yeah, go for it.
Imagine that the Bitcoin assets somehow went to zero, right? The government lost it.
This is a bullish meeting, sir.
Right?
I'm sorry.
So then what happens to the rest of the Bitcoin? And contrast that with what happens if the government loses all its gold. And what happens to the value of the other gold? The value of the other gold in the rest of the market does not necessarily rise as dramatically as I think a loss of the Bitcoin reserve would. Right? Because it was fundamentally mined.
Hard to say. I don't know the answer to that.
We appreciate the deep thinking about the topic, though. I think
Yeah.
this is good, and I think it's also been sobering, or in a good way, I should say, enlivening to see Bitcoiners who tend to be adversarial thinkers thinking adversarially in the wake of this SBR announcement. I think this is good stuff that we should be thinking about. We also touched on it upstairs. Even the idea of 51% of the hash rate coming to America, some people view that as a good thing. Some people looked at that as a potential attack vector. Hard to say. We're going to have to see how this stuff plans out. We're going to have to be vigilant and just sort of make decisions as we see fit moving forward. One thing I do want to talk about, though, so in terms of you're a specialist in obviously setting up ways in which people hold keys.
Wait, do you want me to answer the digital Fort Knox
Please,
question?
yes. We didn't even get to that. My apologies. Yes.
It's all good. Okay, Fort Knox, big fort, big walls, one door, army around the outside, right? And this is great for gold because gold is physical. So even if somebody gets past the army, gets past the front door, then they still gotta have bunch of trucks and an army themselves to cart out 6,000 tons of metal and somehow bring it somewhere. And so that really lends itself to centralized security, right? Because you want it in one place that is very well protected, and then you've got tons of layers of defense around that. Bitcoin is digital, so you really can't know that there's only one front door. Like, it's code there and a lot of process. There could be more than one door to get to this Bitcoin. And then once you get through the door, you can move the Bitcoin with a snap of your fingers. And so you don't have that extra kind of benefit that gold does of like, this thing is heavy and hard to move. And so you have to take the security of the Bitcoin in just a very different way. And I think if you take the approach of, oh, we're going to just stick it with a custodian, which would potentially be the default thinking of the government or of any big institution. You just think, oh, this is the responsible financial thing, is to put it with a custodian. Well, the problem is that Bitcoin transactions are digital and irreversible. And so you have to take your security much more seriously and actually distribute those risk points as much as possible and think about all the different risk points that you're mitigating with your own security. I think the only way you can do that is by holding your own keys. Because if you go back to kind of what I was saying earlier around control and knowledge of true security, you're really, with a custodian, you can only have so much of an understanding of how they are securing the asset. You can do audits on what they're doing. You can, audit their facilities where they have the HSMs. You can look at their code. You can talk to their people. But in the end, they can change those processes over time, and they ultimately have a different incentive than you do as the government securing Bitcoin. Their incentive is, we want to protect as many assets as possible at some floor, like bare minimum floor, where we get economics of scale from protecting all these assets, so we can serve lots of different customers with who want us to protect different assets. And we want to like hit this level and then stop there. And so that means that they're not, by nature, not going to be thinking about what is every single thing we can do to protect this one asset, Bitcoin, as well as possible. And so that's why I think the government has to self-custody, because they have to protect this single strategic asset much better than all the other assets that are not strategic to the government. And so there is no economies of scale. There's only go as deep as possible and making sure that we don't lose this Bitcoin.
Let's talk about what that might look like then. So how do potentially keys get distributed, things like this? So we say, okay, U.S. Digital asset stockpile goes over here with BitGo, whatever big custodian, Anchorage, something like that. We're gonna, custody, the people within the government or people within the sort of bureaucracy are gonna hold these keys. Level of keys in the multi-sig, does this matter? Breaking it up into multiple multi-sigs, how do you see this coming to fruition in your mind? What's an ideal scenario?
Well, I think the cool thing is that great security for Bitcoin can be kind of an equalizer. Like in the digital world, you don't need to necessarily have tons of armies to secure your Bitcoin well. And so that means that an individual could have just about as great a security as a government from a core security model perspective. Like, the government should probably use Bitcoin multisig. And everybody in this room has access to Bitcoin multisig for their own assets, which is kind of crazy that you can have that level of security as just a person. But that's how cryptography works, and so that's cool. I think that what a government has to think about is they've got to think really about like 4 layers, which are, what's the foundational security model? And then so that you've got this foundational security model, and then you start thinking, what are the things that can go wrong as the layers on top of that? So the next layer could be, what happens if the software that I'm using or the infrastructure that I'm using fails? The next level above that could be, what happens if we lose all the keys? The next level above that could be, what happens if the keys are stolen? And so this is like the 4 layers that I've kind of thought about as I've been thinking through this. So we start with the foundational security model, and this is really the core that you have to get right. And if you get this right, it's like 80% or more of the work. And so this is one of the first questions is, how do you generate the keys? So this is where like the thing that the hardcore Bitcoin people have been telling you to do for years, but is actually kind of like crazy and out there, and you don't really need to do it as a normal person. You actually need to do it, which is like to generate a seed phrase. We're not just going to let our cold card or our Trezor make it up for us. We're going to have a special process where we're like rolling dice or using entropy machines or something like that to truly create a random number that we can be confident in. We're doing this probably in some Faraday cage room where there's no electronics, dark, shady Bitcoin shadow people things.
Shadowy coders, shadowy supercoder stuff.
That's what I was looking for. Shadowy supercoders all the way. So then you do all these things, and you have to be really certain that the way that we generated the keys is solid, because if you have a poor key generation at the bottom of it, then the rest of it doesn't even matter. Okay, so you've done that, and then you're like, well, how are we going to store these keys? So you want to think about, we probably want keys on dedicated hardware devices, and it's kind of crazy to think of the government using like a hardware wallet. So I don't know if they would use a hardware wallet or if they would have an HSM or they would have some other dedicated device. Like I do know that like some of our security agencies have the capabilities to actually build their own devices to do things. Like clearly our government built the nuclear code, like the nuclear football or whatever, the briefcase. Maybe it's a briefcase. That's what they showed in that TV
Ledger
show.
didn't build that. Yeah.
No. So maybe they've got a way to build like their own hardware wallet or something, but they're probably using they're using a lot of the same principles that Bitcoin hardware wallets are building. So you've got it on dedicated hardware devices, and you're putting those around the country, probably in bunkers that are protected by military or other special purpose police. Like Fort Knox has something called, and some of the other places that have gold, they've got like the U.S. Mint Police is like a special force dedicated to protecting this. I learned about this last week as I was reading it. And so you probably have like one in Fort Knox, maybe one in the U.S. Fed, maybe a couple of others that are on the West Coast or in the mountains or in the middle. So you've distributed it, so you protect against natural disasters, you protect against people getting in and stealing one key, and then you have physical security and access controls around that such that it's not very easy for somebody to access it. So when you kind of think of this idea of like this bumbling government bureaucrat holding a hardware wallet, that's really not what would happen.
Ideally.
Right, ideally. It's maybe what's happening today.
Yeah, right.
But that's not what would happen.
You're saying this like there's no precedent, Nick.
Yeah, so yes. Well, hopefully that wouldn't happen. And instead you've got like a pretty rigorous process where the military is involved in some way of like, you're checking the boxes to get past the different gates or whatever. So you've got it very well physically secured. And then you're kind of deciding on your Bitcoin security. Is it a 3 of 5 multisig? Is it a 2 of 3 multisig? Are we using miniscript and all these other things? And then
Shout out to
like
Rob.
Your foundational layer of security, basically. And then you build on top of that.
So you build on top of that. You said the headline that we're looking to avoid is the North Korea hacks United States Bitcoin reserve. But I think it's even as recent as the last few days. Elizabeth Warren just said, something along the lines of, "Well, look what just happened with Bybit. North Korea did successfully hack $1.4 billion worth of Ethereum, or worth of ETH, the asset on Ethereum." What is the difference between what happened there and why that wouldn't happen with Bitcoin, or maybe why you think that wouldn't happen with Bitcoin? What is it about the design of Ethereum versus the design of Bitcoin where that wouldn't be as much of a risk vector?
Well, one of the problems with Ethereum is that, so if you've used a hardware wallet with Bitcoin, when you go to like send Bitcoin in a transaction, the hardware wallet says you're sending this much Bitcoin to this address, and it's going to cost this many fees, and it's all like, it's kind of, you got to read through some things, and you got to double check a long address and all of that, but you can read it all. Unfortunately, with Ethereum, especially when you're using a smart contract, so like a multisig, which is what Bybit was using, The thing that you get to verify is much more difficult on the hardware wallet. It basically just looks like a bunch of random symbols and letters.
It's a longer string of symbols and
Longer
letters, right?
string of symbols and letters. It's not very readable. And so what basically happened with Bybit was there was actually a compromise of the software provider. And so the web app that the team was looking at was compromised, and when they thought they were signing one transaction, they were actually signing a different transaction. And that different transaction was changing the smart contract under the hood, which then allowed the North Korean hacker group to basically take control of the wallet and sweep all the money out of it. And so what should have happened was the Bybit team should have noticed that, oh, the thing that I'm approving on my ledger is not the thing that I'm seeing on the screen. But because they didn't, because it's harder to check those things on Ethereum, and then combine that with probably a little bit of laziness, they're like doing this transaction every day for the last 3 years to move Bitcoin or ETH, like in and out of the cold wallet, right? You just kind of get lulled into this sense of complacency, and then suddenly, whoops, you signed over the whole wallet. So the reason that I think this wouldn't happen for like a Bitcoin strategic reserve is two things. One, it's a little bit easier to verify, but two, it should be somebody's job to do this, so that they're not going to be doing it every day, right? So like moving Bitcoin out of this thing will actually be a huge event, and so they should be checking things every which way. And actually, what they should probably be doing is using even different software to be cross-checking these things. So this is one of the benefits of self-custody, right? It's like you can set up Casa, and then you can go take your keys and set up Sparrow, and they should both show you the exact same thing with everything that you're doing. And so the government should probably be doing that with maybe like 2 or 3 different pieces of software if they ever go to move Bitcoin. They should be, starting it in one, checking it in another, checking it in another, and all on an air-gapped device that ideally hasn't been touched or ability to be tampered with.
Fair enough. Last thing before we get into some of the personal stuff, other technical things that would be good to include in the government setup potentially. We talked about time locks potentially. So if we have the potential for something like that, what else could sort of happen at the base sort of technological level that would help in the case that keys do get stolen or even something as simple as, let's say we never get this put into legislation that you can't sell the Bitcoin for 20 years, but we want to time lock it just so that on a technological level, nobody can sell the Bitcoin even if they wanted to. The next administration comes in, say, get rid of this Bitcoin, we don't want it. Well, too bad. Sorry, it's time locked. You can't do anything about it. What else can be done on that level to secure the Bitcoin?
I mean, I think the like rogue time lock for 20 years is kind of funny. But I have a feeling they'd be able to sell it. Like, they'd probably have to sell it at some huge discount, but they basically sell it and like hand over the keys or something like that if some future government decides they don't want to hold Bitcoin anymore. So then the buyer is just taking on like a 20-year kind of time debt until they can actually move the Bitcoin, and maybe they could sell those keys to somebody else, whatever. I think there is some risk with time locking it for an amount as long as 20 years, because if quantum computing becomes a thing during that period, then you're kind of worried about, oh, can this wallet be hacked? And then you get into a very hairy situation when that Bitcoin gets unlocked on chain later. So even if we pass the bill that says we can't sell this Bitcoin for 20 years, we might not want to time lock it for 20 years. But we can still use time locks to our advantage as part of the security model. And maybe these are just shorter time locks that ensure we have time to react if we realize the keys have been stolen. So like you could have a 2-year time lock or something like that. That's a reasonable amount of time that we don't think quantum computing is going to happen in. And then let's say somebody steals one or more of the keys in that time period. This gives us time to react and plan for, like, once this Bitcoin is unlocked, what are we going to do to make sure that it doesn't get stolen? And so in those types of scenarios, I think you could do like pre-signed transactions that are at a really high fee rate. So you could say, we're going to pre-sign a transaction so it's going to another wallet that we own or to a custodian or something like that. And then if we know that keys have been stolen, if we see a transaction hit the mempool that is not our transaction, we immediately broadcast our transaction at a higher fee rate, hopefully, because we picked a very high fee rate at the beginning when we signed the transaction. And then hopefully we kind of like steal that out from them. And it's like a open market kind of theft almost, where we're like trying to re-steal it back, which is a really interesting race to think about. But that's one way to protect against theft. And then you could also protect against loss in a very similar way. Like maybe you have a pre-signed transaction to a custodial account or to another wallet that you own, where even if you lose all the keys, you then take that pre-signed transaction, broadcast it to the network, and that recovers the Bitcoin. And so I think that there are there's some creative ways to protect a very large amount of Bitcoin like this that you can do in self-custody, and that would be what I hope that they are thinking through as they're thinking about how to protect this.
So if you guys are watching, that's it. Listen to this guy. He's got smart stuff. Yeah, question in the back.
Yeah, is the PSBT sort of kind of a workaround if they lose the config file? Because that's the thing that comes to mind, especially if you're thinking about locking up that Bitcoin for an extended period of time. It goes through multiple administrations, potentially different hands. Device goes missing, but if you lose that config file, then we're back at a point that I don't think that we want to be at with the SBR.
Yeah. Well, at that point, so I think what you would want to do is you really want the wallet config to be very redundant. Yeah. You want to have it in a couple of different softwares. You probably want to have it like encrypted and saved on a database, printed out in a QR code and saved in a locked briefcase somewhere in a bunker, all those kind of things. Because you're right, you don't want to lose that thing. Yeah. And to explain, if you lose, let's say you have all the keys, but you don't have the wallet config file. The wallet config file basically tells you how this wallet is set up. And so if you, let's say something happens with your original wallet provider and you're going to a different one like Sparrow or something like that, and you're trying to reload everything up, if you don't have that config file, Sparrow doesn't know how to look for your Bitcoin on the chain and how to like recreate your wallet. And so it's effectively like losing your wallet even if you have all the keys.
Yeah. Another question back there. Yep.
Yeah, you were mentioning in the case of theft, they could do an RBF with a higher fee to try to claim it back. Is that what you're getting at?
It wouldn't be an RBF because, well, hopefully I'm not saying this wrong, but with an RBF, you have to have an existing transaction in the mempool, or already kind of, in the mempool. And then your transaction has to like reference that transaction, say you're replacing it, right?
Okay.
But in this situation, you need to have a transaction ready to go before that one hits the mempool, just in case the reason that has hit the mempool is that they stole your keys and you can't even sign a transaction yourself anymore. So like if they've stolen the keys, you aren't able to sign a replacement transaction. So you have to have already signed a transaction at a high enough fee that you think that if both of these transactions are in the mempool, then the miners are more likely to pick yours and mine it.
Okay, I see. But wouldn't they just raise their fee when they see you've raised your fee?
Yeah, that's where it gets into like kind of a crazy race, right? So I don't...
Well, it's like done by bot. I mean, a similar thing happens now where like there'll be some compromised key at the same time and there'll be two bots bidding against each other and they just bid it all the way up until the fee is just, the entirety. Yeah. I think it's interesting to think about because the miner ends up getting all the stolen Bitcoin.
They win, right? Yeah.
Yeah, do you end up blowing up the Bitcoin basically because you pay it all in the fee effectively?
That's interesting,
Yeah,
too.
I don't know. And maybe this is where the strategic mining comes into play too. Like, do you have partnerships or like something set up with US Bitcoin miners where if this happens, you mine our transaction to recover the Bitcoin?
Another question back there, then we'll come over here. Yeah.
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 Well, what if the miner's based in China or something? Yeah.
We're making all the Bitcoin in America, sir. I'm sorry. Yeah.
We're exporting this
yeah,
Bitcoin.
yeah, we're exporting Bitcoin, right?
Right. All of the Bitcoin will be made here. We'll make sure that it goes through Mara, Clean Spark, and others. But you mentioned something sort of kind of as it relates to tech upgrades, right? And we know that Bitcoin right now, the narratives. So I support your rationale for not having an extended time lock. How do you think the government can work through any upgrades that take place with Bitcoin, right? Like we get more secure addresses, or there may be some additional functionality pieces. Do you ever see the government from a strategic Bitcoin reserve perspective saying, hey, we're going to leverage this Bitcoin to secure some other systems and things in order to get a quote unquote yield on the Bitcoin? Does that crosses the government's radar at all?
I think it depends on how big the asset gets on the government's balance sheet. As it is currently, where it's like somewhere between 1 and 200,000 Bitcoin, depending on whether the government gets to keep Bitfinex as Bitcoin or not. Probably not. So probably more on like the 100,000 side. Like that's still a pretty small amount of the government's balance sheet. So are they going to try and like do yield and things with it? Probably not. But maybe in some future time where they want to leverage it as a financial asset as part of their balance sheet, borrowing against it to do things or whatever it might be, potentially. And then I don't know how, from like how that connects into the Bitcoin protocol upgrades, like maybe they use some of those upgrades or maybe they don't. But I think one of the more interesting things to think about on the protocol upgrade side is, will the government allow Bitcoin protocol upgrades if after Bitcoin becomes a strategic asset? Or will they be too worried that this might like blow up the value of their asset?
Definitely a concern, Isaac. Yeah.
On that thought, what comes to mind though is, based on what you're saying, in order to protect the Bitcoin, if in the future like op vault becomes a thing, that's exactly what you're talking about.
Right.
You no longer need to pre-sign a transaction for future broadcast. You would have op vault, and it would protect that Bitcoin.
Yes, I think that there's definitely there's people that are worried about the government maybe blocking all future upgrades to Bitcoin, and I'm not necessarily in that camp for that reason. Like there are clear upgrades that make things more secure, especially for people securing large balances. And then I actually think that in the near term, the government isn't going to care enough or be organized enough to block upgrades to Bitcoin. So I think we probably have a window of time where it's like they're just not paying attention, and we can still get Bitcoin upgrades done like normal. And then there's going to be the types of upgrades that we must make that are like against quantum protection or give us quantum protection at some point. And that'll almost be like, I think that will be an opportunity to like get other updates done that we haven't been able to get done.
Omnibus bill.
Yes,
put 'em all
exactly.
through.
It's like just you got to keep the government open, so just shove it all in there.
Just do it. Yeah.
So there's that, and then eventually the government will start to care enough, and then I think it will be harder to get things done. But hopefully they are still like maybe even helping with some of the good updates to Bitcoin that make it more secure. But I think it does slow down because of that eventually.
And I think we can always just send Shinobi to the government to talk to them. He's good at that stuff. I think he'd be excited. Yeah, one more question back here. Yeah.
Yeah, this is just a kind of trivial question, but what do you think about storing the Bitcoin in Fort Knox, actually? Like secretly stamping the actual keys on gold bars, and it's stored in the same place as Fort Knox.
Whoa.
Is gold good for that? Like, isn't gold kind of soft? Would we want to be stamping things into gold?
Well, they might be filled with tungsten, so
That's
go,
right.
Okay.
go a little
Could
deeper.
be
Might not be
softer, right?
actual gold. Yes.
Wow. Okay. Well, I think we're gonna stop. Pivot there over to sort of more personal stuff. Any last questions though about the SBR, broader stuff about the security? Cool. Well, I appreciate the questions. Let's shift over to a video you put out a few months back: social engineering attacks, these phishing scams where people, call you and they get your keys and you lose all your Bitcoin in the process. You made a really clever video on how someone tried to do it to you. You sort of paid attention, were able to sort of walk us through how the process went. How frequent are these scams? So I know one or two people, think it happens a lot? I mean, are you getting calls at Casa where this is happening frequently? What does it look like with this? And does the product that you have, what you've created with Casa, does it defend against this?
So, okay, so the for the people that don't know, what happens with these social engineering scams is somebody calls you on the phone, pretends to be Coinbase or Swan or whoever, and they are like, your account is in danger, and we're going to help you make it safe. And so they get you kind of freaked out, and then they say, but don't worry, I'm with the support team here, and so I'm going to just walk you through how to save your money. And as they walk you through how to save your money, they end up then telling you to send it to them. And so then you send them your Bitcoin, and then they peace out.
Everything is sad.
Yeah. So, sorry, what was the first part of the question?
So how frequent are these? Are
It's
these
very frequent.
Very frequent.
Actually, if probably everybody in this room has like bought a ledger at some point, and so you're probably on the ledger leak, or there's a bunch of different exchange leaks and different wallet providers, and so you're probably on a list, and you probably get phone calls all the time from like unknown numbers, and I bet if you picked all of them up, like 25 to 30% or more of them would be scammers trying to steal your money. So I think it's very frequent, and when I decided that I was going to try to like get one of these guys to talk to me, it didn't take me very long of just answering unknown numbers before it was one of them. And so it's relatively frequent. And the guy on the phone, I talked to this guy, and he told me how they do everything. Like after he realized he wasn't going to be able to scam me, I was like, how many people do you get with this? And he said, I think he said that some weeks he was making like $50,000 a week just stealing money from people. And so it's pretty sad. But they're getting a lot of people, and the reason that they can do this is that it's the account structure of like having an exchange that you log into with one kind of login and then can send your money somewhere irreversible is just a very difficult thing to protect against, which is why a better scenario is one like Casa, where you have like multiple points where you have to go approve it, and it's not necessarily because that inherently prevents you from getting tricked, but it adds all this extra friction to move your money that they don't want to deal with because there's easier targets out there. And so if you're like, well, I could thank you for calling me. I'm gonna go to my other key that I have to drive to that's in the bank safety deposit box or something like that. They're just gonna be like, bye. Yeah. So that because he did say on the phone they go through people quick. It's a speed like volume game. And so if they aren't going to be able to get you very quickly, then they move on to the next target because there's somebody else who has worse security than you do. So I think that's one way that Casa protects you. But the biggest thing is just knowing that like generally exchanges aren't going to call you and aren't going to tell you to do things. Coinbase has gotten a little bit better about this because they've lost so much money to it. Like there are things now where in Coinbase, what I've heard anyway is they've got things where if you get to certain parts of their support center or something, they've got little things that say, are you talking to a Coinbase employee right now? And if you say, yes, you're talking to a Coinbase employee, they lock down your whole account. Because they literally will never talk to you.
Right. I was going to say, you can't get anybody from Coinbase on the phone. Right?
And they even know that. So they're like, okay, if you're talking to somebody from Coinbase, you're not talking
This
to
isn't
somebody.
going, yeah.
No.
It's a feature, not a bug.
Yeah, it's a feature, not a bug. Yeah, their lack of customer support is a feature, not a bug. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
So they're working on it. But Zach XBT who's a great follow on Twitter if you don't follow him.
He's like an online sleuth, blockchain sleuth. He looks at who stole what and does a lot of the research, probably as good as any government professional, if not better in most cases.
Oh, yeah. Better. So he did a thread recently where he found out that Coinbase basically lost about $300 million to social engineering last year, and $60 million of that happened in December and January alone. So tons of money going out from Coinbase alone, and I'm sure it's happening on other exchanges too. So it's a real problem, and it's something that we as an industry need to solve, because this happens in the banking world as well. I've talked to one friend who works at a bank, and he's like, yeah, we actually deal with this social engineering problems too. And we generally have like 1, maybe 2 days to catch it, and then we can like reverse the transaction and get the person's money back. And so if you can catch it in the traditional banking world, then that's great. But that is not a thing in Bitcoin. The second it's gone, it's gone, unless you've got a very deep setup with like the vaulting side of things that we were talking about, which most people don't. Yep. So it's a big problem.
Understood. Speaking of other big problems in terms of security, Jameson Lopp, your partner at Casa, speaks frequently about wrench attacks. So, he talks about this a lot. I think he was just on What Bitcoin Did talking about it, and he also mentioned on that episode that they happen more frequently than you think. It's happened to well-known personalities in the space. I think it was actually Rizzo, my boss at Bitcoin Magazine, talking about, if you are sort of a public personality in this space, it's always something that's in the back of your mind, right? So how frequently do these happen, and what can people do to protect against them? And when I say wrench attack, that means literally somebody coming up to you in your physical space saying, hey, give me your Bitcoin, I have a knife, I have this wrench, I'm going to hurt you if you don't give it to me. So how frequent are these? What can we do to protect against them?
So it is frequently in the news, but infrequently happens to like everyday people. So if you aren't somebody who's like super public about owning Bitcoin, it is generally unlikely to happen to you. But it is still the case that sometimes kind of random people do have this happen to them. Weirdly, it always seems to happen in Europe. I don't know why. But like the ones that end up in the news tend to be in Europe.
I could tell you why. Actually, I think in Europe, in many European countries, it's not against. I think there's a public database of addresses. So if I looked up whatever Nick or Frank or something, I could very easily find your address. I think that has something to do with it. Eric Wall has talked about that. But
I think Sweden in particular has this problem.
Got it.
Which maybe is where Eric is from or has lived.
Yes.
But they your assets are like publicly reported. Anyway, so. With wrench attacks, the best way you can protect yourself against them is to just not be publicly known to own crypto. But if you are known and you want to be an active participant in the community and all of that, then the way to protect yourself against them is to make sure that you are not able to move your money from your one location. And this is one of the core security design decisions that we've made with Casa, is that because you have multiple keys protecting your Bitcoin, you shouldn't keep all of those keys in the same place, and you should need to travel somewhere else to move Bitcoin. And so then what this ultimately results in is, it may not actually, unfortunately, save you from some of the pain of like somebody coming and beating you up and trying to steal your money, but they at least won't be able to get your money. And so at some point they will like have to give up or try to kidnap you and take you to the bank and get you to access your hardware wallet, right? And so the way to protect yourself is first to be like good about your privacy and OPSEC, and then second to make sure that your keys are distributed so that they can't take your Bitcoin. And a lot of times people are like, well, I should just use an exchange because then I don't have the keys, and so they can't force me to move the Bitcoin. And that's the wrong answer, because we've actually had a client before who, luckily they didn't get beat up, but they got drugged with a special kind of drug that was like, makes you very suggestible. And so then it was like a date drug. And so it was like a woman at a bar, like spiked his drink and then took him home and stole the money that was in his Coinbase account. And it's because all you need is your phone then to send the money out of Coinbase, so they can it's like a single point of failure is your login to Coinbase. So all they got to do is just do that, and then they can steal the money. But they couldn't steal the money that was in Casa because he didn't have all the keys with him. And so like even in that scenario, which is like scary but less bad than having your finger chopped off, you still
For this, yeah, for the I was gonna say that's the what was that the
was the
CTO of
Ledger-
Ledger,
not
yes.
the CTO, one of the old co-founders.
The old co-founders was kidnapped and actually had his finger chopped off in the process, and he eventually did give up a certain amount of Bitcoin and Tether or something like that.
Well, so what they did, that was a little bit different. They didn't steal his money because he probably had good security. They were ransoming him to Ledger. And what Ledger did, which was pretty smart of them, was they paid the ransom in Tether, and they worked with Tether beforehand so that after they paid the ransom and they released the guy, Tether just froze all the USDT. And so, unlike Bitcoin, Tether and all stable coins can be frozen, and so it's a bad thing to receive a ransom in case you're planning for that.
Yeah, I was gonna say, right. Don't go kidnapping anybody and requesting Tether tonight. Yeah, I think we had a question over here. Yeah.
Is there a way to prove that you don't have a key? Like, so if someone
wow,
comes
that's
to
a great
attack
question.
me and I say, well, I only have 1 out of the 3. I mean, the only way I can think of is that, like, you have a custodian and you verify that your account is with a custodian and they're aware of how that works. But is there any other way to say, I really don't have it? I'm not just fooling with you.
Right.
It's not that I have to go to my bank. It's like, truly, I don't have it. It's on the other side of the world. Or, I mean, what can you do?
No, I think no, there really isn't. And so what some people do is they'll keep like a losable amount of Bitcoin on a hardware wallet that it's like at their house where they're like, here it is. Here's my 0.5 Bitcoin or something. Depending on how OG.
That's a losable amount to Nick.
Sorry, not to me, but I'm talking about some of the OG people that I have talked to this about. You know, would you give up 0.5 Bitcoin to keep a finger?
100%.
Probably. So I think that's one way that some people have approached it. But Jameson has talked about this too. In that scenario, you kind of have to hope that they don't, for some reason, believe that you have more than that amount. Because then you could give up that amount, and they're like, yeah, but I know you have like way more Bitcoin than this. You've been around long enough to have more Bitcoin. So
One
it's
of
a tricky one.
the funnier parts when he told that story on what Bitcoin did, some people he told, and it's a sad scenario. I'm not making light of it, but he told the story of like the person being like, no, this is literally it. I know I'm whatever a public figure, or I know I've talked about having Bitcoin online, but this is literally all I have. So yeah, there's always that sort of variable that you have to sort of be wary of if somebody is going to attack you. But it is interesting. Yeah, sometimes people might be under the impression that you have much more than you actually do, which could lead to a very drawn-out scenario that would not be good. Yeah.
And I think this is where, like, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, because there are tools that you can use that help reduce your online footprint. So So what some people know, a lot of people don't, is basically your address is kind of out there everywhere on the internet for people to find. But there are tools that will go around and delete that automatically for you. And this is something that's really worth doing. They cost like $100 a year. There's one that we've partnered with called Privacy Hawk. There's another one called Canary. There's deleteme.com. I think it's deleteme.com. There's a bunch of these, and they're like $100 a year. You give them your address and past addresses and some of your personal information, and then it just automatically constantly goes around on the internet and deletes it from the data brokers and all that kind of thing. And so that's one way to protect yourself. Another way is to use like remailing boxes. So there's a service called Earth Class Mail where you can open up a mailbox that is that can receive mail for you and then forward it to you. So basically, every time you go buy something online, you send it to that address, they get it, and then they re-forward it to you. It kind of sucks because it makes everything longer to receive, and then you have to pay them to ship it to you every time, so it does add up. But if you're very paranoid, that's another way to do it. That actually saved me from the Ledger hack. So I used that, and that address was in the Ledger hack instead of my real address. And so you can even use it only for things that would like tie you to cryptocurrency, only for purchases that would tie you to cryptocurrency.
Smart. Yeah. Question over here.
Yeah, just to confirm my understanding of the private key stuff. I mean, you could also have a private key that has some coins on it, but then separately that private key is used in a 2 of 3 multi-sig, which the attacker would have no idea. And they also have no idea that you could have a passphrase, right? So you get easily some money on the private key and then have a passphrase with your real stack, correct?
Yes, that's right. But you would want to consider kind of how you set that up and be careful about it, because let's say they come to your house and you're like keeping that key plus the seed phrase at your house, and then you have a passphrase on it that's like protecting the real amount of Bitcoin. Well, if they steal the key and the seed phrase because they're knowledgeable enough to know they need the seed, then you might actually kind of be screwing yourself, because then you can't recreate that key elsewhere in order to use the passphrase to access the Bitcoin.
Right.
So that's like, you want to be careful that you don't actually create a single point of failure with that. And then with the 2 of 3 part of that, yes, you could have one key as part of a 2 of 3 multi-sig and also store funds only on that single key that you could then give away. And you would just want to make sure that out of the 2 of 3, you don't have another one in your house too. You wouldn't want 2 in one place.
Makes sense. One of the big things, this was a question that I think is really important, is that oftentimes we can sort of receive all this information cognitively, maybe understand, walk away from this thinking, Casa sounds great, I should do that to secure my Bitcoin stack, that's great, but people don't take that step. So the human psychology angle, why don't people who get Casa, they have the $20 a month to spend on it, what is sometimes that mental hurdle people need to get over when it comes to upgrading their security?
There's probably 2 mental hurdles. One of them is like the rainy day hurdle, which is like, I'm going to do that on the weekend. And then the weekend gets here and you're like, no, I'm going to watch Drive to Survive this weekend, which is what I do many times. So there's that where it's just like, you kind of have to do the thing. And for that, we've tried to make it very easy, where it takes a very little amount of time to set up Casa to just lower that barrier. And then the other one is just being vaguely scared about doing it, and we probably run into this one a decent amount too, which is like, you're like, I've got some Bitcoin on a ledger that I haven't looked at in like 3 years. We call it Schrodinger's Bitcoin. As long as you don't look at the ledger, you still have the Bitcoin. And so, or you don't, you could be there, could be. So anyway, you've got your Schrodinger's Bitcoin, and you're kind of like, do I really want to open that box up and move it into Casa, even though I know it's a safer place to put it? And for that, I would just say that's another one of those, you just got to do the thing, because once you do it, it's actually not as scary as you think it was. And depending on kind of what you're doing with Casa, we'll actually do this with you. So for some of our like more advanced plans, we've helped people get Bitcoin off of paper wallets from 2013 that they were terrified of touching this thing and didn't even know really how to get the Bitcoin off of it. And so we've Jameson gets on a call with you and is like, here's how we're going to recover this Bitcoin. And so we've done a lot to try and help people through this, because it can feel scary moving from an older setup to a new one. And then once you get set up with Casa, everybody's like, wow, I feel so much better. And so that's worth it, especially when it's a material amount of money that you're storing.
Appreciate that. Generally speaking, just sort of, we talked about this a little bit before, like bigger threats to Bitcoin in general. We talked about the ETFs. Certain people maybe, we have more and more people sort of looking at Bitcoin as a financial asset, not necessarily wanting to go through setting up, a multi-sig, owning, taking self-custody and all of this kind of stuff. As we move forward, as Bitcoin gets further adopted and stuff, what's on your mind in terms of overall security of the network?
I think that one of the bigger risks to Bitcoin is that we keep kind of building up like ETFs and qualified custodians, and we put this kind of traditional financial system rails and protections around things, which actually in the short term can be good, because it means that you have fewer like exchange hacks and that kind of thing. But then in the long term, potentially pose a real systemic risk to Bitcoin. Because basically, it all goes back to kind of what we were saying earlier about Bitcoin being a digital bearer asset where transactions are irreversible. If you put too much Bitcoin into Fort Knox in one place, there's just more and more of a honeypot for somebody to like get that and steal it, or chance that if you make a mistake, it's a really catastrophic loss. And so, for example, I think Coinbase today protects almost 3 million Bitcoin. So over 10% of the network is protected by Coinbase. And what I've actually started hearing sometimes from people that we're like talking to about potentially using Casa, more on the institutional side, is they generally are, or will sometimes say, well, I'm just going to keep it with Coinbase, because actually if Coinbase messes up, all of Bitcoin and everything else will be so wrecked for so long that like the prices will be down and it'll be worth nothing anyway.
I think Meltem Demirors was on stage here once, and she was like, "No, Coinbase is going to be too big to fail eventually. We're all good. Everything's all right." So,
That's the problem.
I would say
There
this is
no
not the
too
way
big
we
to
want to think.
fail.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Like, and Meltem knows this. I've talked to her about this. But there is no too big to fail because you can't print more Bitcoin.
Two questions. The first is, are there any authenticator or password manager apps that Casa recommends people using? Second, for people doing the geographically distributed multi-sig, like what are some best practices for the geographically distributed signing device? Is it like safety deposit box at a bank, or maybe what are other things that you see people do that work well?
So, password manager, I really like 1Password. I would not use LastPass. They've had problems before that have resulted in a lot of seed phrases being stolen. So I like 1Password. Generally, don't put seed phrases in there that secure meaningful amounts of money. I put seed phrases in 1Password sometimes when I'm like testing new apps and I know I'm not going to keep Bitcoin in here, but I got to say the seed phrase somewhere. But I think 1Password is great. And for me, it's like the best trade-off between usability and kind of a big name. Kind of. Some people like Bitwarden or KeyPass, I think, is another one, because you can self-host those. And so if you're into that, those are options. I think 1Password is the best. So authenticator, like 2FA authenticator. Not SMS. Yeah, not SMS. For the things that really matter, get a YubiKey and use a YubiKey with a Yubico authenticator app, because what that does is it means you actually, so most authenticator apps, you kind of open the app on your phone and boom, there's all of your codes. With a Yubico authenticator app, you have a YubiKey, which is a separate device. You plug that into your phone, and then that shows you the codes. So the codes are actually generated by the key itself. So it's almost like having a hardware wallet for your 2FA. And for things that control basically all of your life, like Google, your Gmail account, your Apple account, those kinds of things, that's probably better to have like hardware-based 2FA for that. Side note on that, you really should protect the crap out of your Apple account and your Google account, because those are basically often the keys to like the rest of your online life. And if somebody were to hack those, that's a big entry point into everything else. So Gmail is actually one of the big points that social engineers go after. Sometimes you'll like get a call from Google, and it's like a scammer trying to get access to your email, because then they can go reset all of your passwords and get into all of your online accounts, from like bank accounts and all that stuff from there. So get a YubiKey and use that as your 2FA. You can use it as direct 2FA for Google and Apple, and that's the safest way to do 2FA. But if you have to do a code, then get a YubiKey and use Yubico Authenticator for the code. And then for things that you care less about, that aren't like financial accounts, but you need 2FA, I think something like Google Authenticator is fine, but just make sure that you turn off the cloud sync for it.
Is that in the Google Authenticator app, or do you have to go to like your Google?
It's in the settings of the Google
Yeah,
Authenticator
I think it's in the
app.
settings of the mobile app. Yeah. So I use Google Authenticator app, but I just turn off the cloud sync. So that means that if anything ever happens to my Google account, it's not like somebody can download all the 2FA codes. So those are all of my recommendations on password managers and YubiKeys, or in 2FA. And then for geographically distributed multi-sig, we see you need to think about your own threat level. So it's basically like, how much Bitcoin are you securing? How meaningful is it to your personal net worth? All of that, and how catastrophic is a loss, and the more, and how big of a target are you actually? And the more that steps up, the tighter the security needs to get with your geographic distribution. But generally, it's good to have a safety deposit box somewhere that you're putting a key in, because that requires physical access through the bank where they're checking your ID to make sure it matches their box and all of that kind of thing. And you actually have to have a key. Sometimes people will keep it at family members' houses, in a locked safe, or at another property of theirs, depending on if they own another house, but most people don't. So family members' houses really solves that. I think those are probably the two biggest things we see: family members' houses and safety deposit boxes. And then just make sure that, generally you want to think, can a natural disaster take out all of my keys at once? And if so, then a key needs to move farther.
Great points.
The LA fires, great example of that, right? You could think, oh, I'm good. I've got a key at my house and a key at my brother's house who lives a mile away, and then the fire wipes out both houses.
Any other questions? Anything about, especially really, yeah, Daniel in the back? Yeah. Yeah.
I have two questions. One is, if you have multiple keys and somebody's dollar cost averaging, do you do anything to accommodate UTXO consolidation? Is there?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, what we do with Casa is, if we notice that you get to 100 UTXOs, we pop up and say, hey, you've got too many UTXOs, you should consolidate these. Generally, what I recommend that people do is, if they're dollar cost averaging for a small amount on a very regular basis, daily, weekly, that kind of thing, you should basically DCA in the exchange to a certain level and then move it to your cold storage, so that you keep a smaller number of UTXOs.
Whenever you get to whatever $2,000 worth, $3,000, something like that.
Whatever
just
your threshold
random number,
is
exactly.
that you pick, basically, yeah. The other thing you can do, if you really don't want to keep anything on an exchange, you want to move it off immediately, is you can DCA to a mobile wallet, so the single key wallet in Casa. You can just DCA to that, and then when it hits a certain amount, you spend it over to the multi-sig. And the reason that is cheaper is because sending from a single sig wallet is cheaper than sending from a multi-sig wallet.
Good to know.
And so you can you're basically DCAing the Bitcoin into a hot wallet over time, and then when it hits the threshold, you move from the hot wallet to your cold wallet.
Here. Sorry. My other question was, do you guys work with, so I have some Bitcoin in I don't think that was hers, that was the other lady that was sitting here. So if I have some Bitcoin in a self-directed IRA, do you guys work with any companies for that, as far as doing multiple keys? Because it's a whole gray area as far as self-custody goes, and a non-disqualified person having ownership of it. So
yeah, so you can use a self-directed IRA and use Casa.
Okay.
We don't have a self-directed IRA ourselves, but basically it's kind of a legal gray area, like you said, but generally it appears that you're allowed to hold your own keys.
your brother can.
In a self-directed IRA. No, it can be you holding the keys.
Okay.
It's just that the IRA provider has to know that you haven't moved the Bitcoin, basically, without it being a movement through their platform.
You can't have unfettered control, basically.
You're not a. Yes, I think. I don't know. you're getting past my level of
But you deal
knowledge.
with that. Casa has accommodations for something
I know
like
that we have people. So we used to have a partnership with a company called Choice, and we wound that down, but we still have people using that. And then we also have other people who will have an IRA with a different platform, but they'll hold the keys using Casa.
Cool.
And our team knows how to do that better than I do, but it's possible.
Good. Thank you.
Yep. Question back here. Yep.
That was some good athletics. Thank you, real quick. Thank you, by the way, for this talk. As someone who deals with computer security in the hacking world, this was like really interesting and performative. And I want to quickly shout out that if people really want like a good overuse of security in their general life, including this, privacyguides.org is a really great like base level resource to see how easy it is, multiple levels.
Could you repeat the website name?
Privacyguides.org.
Privacyguides.
Yep. Two quick questions because I got here a little bit after. One is, did you mention anything at all about in terms of like sending and interacting with either Bitcoin or data using more privatized stuff such as the dirty word VPN or what I'm more thinking like the Tor network in order, because a lot of wallets interface now with like the Tor network, particularly the ones that I know. And the quick second question is, what do you think is the potential new attack stuff that we might be seeing in the next 2 to 5 years with Bitcoin? Personally, myself, the two interesting things, because I see it in other fields, is one, and this is crazy, sensing voltages off of your keyboards and monitors and phones in order to see what you're typing. And my absolute favorite is I have hacker friends who generate birth and death certificates to basically make mules to move stuff around. And it's even more creepy with AI because when they generate the birth certificate, they can make it seem like this person is a living person and then kill them and move assets. It's pretty crazy. So where's some of the next stuff that you might see coming in the avalanche of bullshit?
We're trying to have a nice. Why you did?
Okay, so on the first question, I think I think that it's possible that we start to see some of those crazier types of attacks on high-value targets, but you have to be really like you can do things that make that incredibly difficult to pull off as an attack against you that are like you can do relatively simple things to make that incredibly difficult to pull off. So an example of that would just be you're using a multi-sig with keys in different places on different types of hardware. And even that, it's like, well, suddenly, like, if they had a microphone listening to your computer somehow, like in your office, and then you're traveling to a family member's house to like sign on a different device, that breaks their ability to steal whatever, you know. So I think that one, I don't know too much. Like, I'm not sure on that, honestly. I don't have a great answer that's like, this is a crazy attack that I think we might see happen. I think it's mostly going to be more of the basic stuff, like social engineering, that kind of thing, where they're just plain old tricking people. And you would think, wow, no way is somebody able to be tricked into just literally giving somebody else their money, but it happens all the time. And so why do the crazy stuff when you can do that? And then on the second question about, sorry, what was the second question?
VPNs and Tors
Yeah.
stuff.
Using Bitcoin over Tor and VPNs, I think that's good. I mean, I think, like, it depends kind of on what you're trying to accomplish and what level of privacy you're looking for and why. You know, like if you're using Tor to hide from the government, that's probably not going to work because the government runs a bunch of Tor nodes and knows everything that goes on Tor anyway. And so, but if you're using Tor to hide from other people, then maybe that works better. I don't know. So I think that all of those things, like using a VPN, is a good part of general privacy hygiene. And generally, I think I use a VPN every day on all of my stuff, and it's not actually to protect myself against Bitcoin things. It's so that my ISP doesn't see every single website I go to and like sell that data for other people to market to me.
Question in the back.
What happens when AI is doing the social engineering?
Oh yeah. So luckily right now AI still kind of sucks at this, but I think it's going to be a really big problem. And particularly on the deepfake side. So I think KYC as we know it today is probably going to completely break, because it's very based on like, oh, I take a photo with my photo ID and hold it up to the camera, and then you verify that it's me. And when you can create a deep fake of somebody trivially, I think that totally breaks. So I think we're going to have to think about different ways of handling anti-money laundering than KYC. And I think that, but right now, like, there are actually instances you can find online of videos of North Korea hacker groups trying to get jobs at Bitcoin and crypto companies, and they're trying to use AI deepfakes on a interview, and it's still like really bad. You can really tell that it's fake, and so as long as you have some wherewithal, you can see right through it. But it's only getting better, and so I think that will become a real risk that we will have to think about other ways to actually defend against that kind of thing.
Great question. More question over here first. Yeah.
Really appreciate the talk and all the information shared. You touched on time locks, which is something I'm not as familiar with, and the government maybe using it as a tool, as a security measure. Is that something that individuals can use? Is that something that Casa offers in terms of a security protection tool, and maybe the ease of implementing, say, staggered time locks, the same way you have staggered bond maturities for people investing, say, in fixed deposits, right? So you could just touch on the time lock part, and then the second part is you were referencing Ledger and some hack, and I remember reading an article about them offering some backdoor type of service for recovery purposes. Do you compromise a multi-sig based on, I guess, your or Casa's view from a security standpoint, or if Ledger gets compromised as part of a multi-sig, it shouldn't be an issue?
So on the time locks question, we actually don't offer time locks in Casa today. I think generally for individuals, time locks are unnecessary. Like, I would actually say in almost every scenario, you don't want to use a time lock unless you're the US government or you're like MicroStrategy maybe. You have to be holding a ton of Bitcoin for a really long time. And otherwise, the problems with it are that you introduce other pieces of data to the wallet config that we were talking about earlier that you must keep, and if you lose that, then you could completely lose your Bitcoin. And then you also run into situations where it's like, I think people want to get cute with time locks where they're like, I'm going to lock this up for 10 years, and then 7 years in, they decide, oh, I need to sell this Bitcoin for this life event, and they can't. And so I don't think it's necessary for most people from a security perspective. And then, so we haven't built it because it's relatively complex, and we think like a very small percentage of people can actually use it. And then on your second question, which I forgot. Tell me what's your second.
Ledger.
Yes.
Well, years ago, I think.
Yeah. So a couple years ago, or maybe even longer than that, like 4 years ago, Ledger had a email list hack that basically leaked all of their customers' data. So that's the Ledger hack that I was referring to, where it was like a mailing, and like they got physical addresses, phone numbers, emails, names, all of that kind of thing. And that was just this giant honeypot for hackers to then run through that list and try and scam people or wrench attacks or whatever. But then I think a year ago, Ledger released a feature that is people talk about the backdoor feature. And basically what this is they called it Ledger Recover. They still have it, and it lets you, it takes your seed phrase and it splits it into a couple of encrypted shards and then shares them with different organizations. CoinCover's one of them, Ledger's one of them, and then there might be one more. And so basically what they do with that is like, it's a subscription, and in case you lose your seed phrase, you can recover it from these organizations. And the whole idea is it's almost like a multi-sig for a single key. So it's like you need 2 out of the 3 key shards in order to create your private key, in order to recreate your private key. So Ledger by themselves doesn't have your key. CoinCover by themselves doesn't have your key. The third entity doesn't have your key. But with them coming together, they can help you recreate it if you lose it. What a lot of people were worried about was they're worried about how this was a way to basically extract the seed phrase from the Ledger device. And my personal opinion is I think that Ledger probably built the feature correctly where they are doing everything on the device to split it into encrypted shards, and then only those shards leave the device. But the kind of max security, max paranoid way to think about it would be like, if they mess something up with that and humans are going to be humans, then maybe there's a way to exfiltrate the seed phrase. I think all of this gets made relatively trivial and like something you don't have to worry about when you put a ledger into a multi-sig, especially a multi-sig with other things that aren't ledgers. Because then even if that ledger happens to be compromised, you've got another key that's on your phone, another key that's held by Casa, or maybe another key that's on a Trezor or a cold card. And so then you just have these other layers of security for your Bitcoin that make it so that even if that one ledger gets compromised, your Bitcoin isn't compromised.
I think we had a question over here, and then did you have a question as well? Yeah.
You were talking about shards. Is that alluding to Slip 39? And if
Slip
so,
39 is a version of it.
Okay. And if
Yeah.
so, my question was, is there a benefit to Slip 39 versus BIP 39?
Oh, wait, sorry. Yes, Slip 39 is a different thing. Slip 39 is made by Trezor. And so what I was thinking you were referring to was what Ledger's actually using under the hood is called Shamir's secret sharing. And Trezor also has a Shamir secret sharing feature. But theirs doesn't go to different companies. It basically gets put onto little SD cards that you like slide into the Trezor. And then Slip 39, I think, is similar to BIP 39, which are basically just the seed phrase words. And I actually don't know the technical difference between the two. But it's like the BIP 39 is like, I'm pretty sure, the list of seed phrase words.
The 3,200 words or something like. Is it that many words?
I don't know.
2048. Okay.
It's a different set of words, but I thought when you were talking about the shards, because with Slip 39 is from your secret, you can break it up
Right.
into shards. That's where I made the connection.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so Shamir secret sharing is what the shard references.
Yeah. Isaac, and then we'll come over here. Yeah.
I also have 2 questions. One is, how does Casa deal with inheritance? And then if you could briefly talk about the difference between Casa and your competitors.
Yeah. So the difference between Casa and our competitors is that we're better.
Imagine that. Any evidence to back that up, or just a vibe?
We run on vibes. Okay, so the inheritance question. We put a bunch of work into inheritance because this is something that so we released it last April or May, and back in the December before that, we were talking to our customers and saying, what still worries you when you're using Casa? And the number one thing that came back is, what happens if I die? How's my family going to be able to get access to this Bitcoin? Because most of the time, a family has like one Bitcoin person, and then everybody else is like, have fun playing with your Bitcoins. And so you have to, when we built this feature, we were like, we have to build for the people that don't really care about Bitcoin and are just, like, they need help. They need to not be dealing with a hardware wallet, basically, or a metal seed phrase plate or something, trying to figure out in a terrible time of their life where their loved one died, trying to figure out how to work this Bitcoin stuff. And so what we did was, for the base case of what, like our standard 2 of 3 multi-sig, what we did is we wanted to say, all the beneficiary should need is their phone in order to access the Bitcoin. And so the way it works is you as the account owner have a 2 of 3 multi-sig. One key's on your phone, one key's on a hardware wallet, and one key's held by Casa. And then you invite somebody to be your beneficiary. And so they set up a free Casa account. They log in, they see a little invite about your inheritance setup, and all they got to do is scan a QR code on your phone, and then they're set up. And so what that does is when they scan the QR code, it takes an encrypted version of that key on your phone and stores it on their phone, and then backs it up encrypted to their iCloud or Google Drive. So now they have one key. You're basically sharing a key. It's a copy of it is on both phones. And then let's say you pass away. They go into the Casa app, they say, my family member passed away, I'm requesting access to this vault, and that starts a 6-month timer. And then during that 6 months, we're sending you emails and notifications to your Casa app that are saying, hey, vault access was requested. If you're alive, go in and hit this button to cancel it. And so then you go in, you hit the button, cancel it, the access is rejected. But if you don't do that, at the end of the 6 months, then the vault pops up on their app, they're able to access it. Before this point, they can't even see how much Bitcoin is in there. And so the vault pops up, they're able to access it, and they use the key that's on their phone and the key that's held by Casa to get to 2 out of 3 keys. So they basically request Casa to sign, and because you've already told Casa that this person is your beneficiary, we will sign a transaction for them. And so then that gets you to 2 out of 3 keys. And then for our higher security level, which is a 3 out of 5, you're basically sharing the phone key plus 1 hardware key with them. And then our team is there to walk them through every step of the way of like using the hardware wallet and all of that. So the whole principle is we want to make this as easy as possible for the beneficiary, because that's the person who actually we care about with this feature. And so that's the approach we take. And it really, like, every time I talk to somebody who's a little bit worried about inheritance, I tell them just go try this, because it takes literally like 3 minutes to set up. It's just, if you can create an account online, then your beneficiary will be able to do this. And you can do all of it, like, we have a 30-day trial. So you can even do it for free. You can go in, use the 30 days, you set up your 2 of 3, you set up inheritance. The whole thing should take about 20 minutes, and then you can decide if you like it or not. But that's how inheritance works. And then to answer your question for real, actually, did I get everything on inheritance? Okay. To answer your question for real on the competitors, I think there's a bunch of different, like, very practical things that you could say. Our main competitor's Unchained. I like the Unchained people. Joe, the CEO, like, he and I texted him the other day saying, like, congrats on this podcast that they sponsored that Elon happened to retweet, and like the Unchained like name is like retweeted by Elon. I was like, game recognizes game. So I like the Unchained guys. I think they've done a good job. And the main differences between us though are basically Casa has a mobile app and they're just desktop, and Casa is very focused on security, whereas they do a lot more financial service type of stuff. And in general, I think that out of everybody in the industry, we have focused the most on having very approachable design that is super easy to use for people. And I think if you test out kind of us and some of our competitors, then you will really see that. The other thing that I think that is, there are some newer entrants to the market that are doing a good job with UX. There's like, I think PubKey's done a pretty good job with UX. I think Thea has done a pretty good job with UX. But one of the things that works against them and works in our favor is we were actually just talking about this as a team at an offsite like a month ago. One of the best things about Casa and one of our most strategic competitive advantages is time in market without fuck-ups. So we've been around since 2018 without losing people's Bitcoin, whereas some of these other companies have been around for like a year with their kind of multi-sig product, oftentimes which is modeled very similarly to Casa's product. And so you kind of have to think like, okay, do I want to trust the company that's only been around for a year, or do I want to trust the company that's been around for 6 years without like a big blow up happening? And I think that gives a huge advantage to both us and Unchained, because we've both been around since about 2018, been in market for 6 years without problems. So that's a big thing, I think, from a competitive standpoint.
Yeah, appreciate that. Over here, yeah.
So I'm going to finish with the inheritance question. I checked an email that said that you were no longer servicing iPhone 7 or iPhone 6, and maybe it was a scam, maybe it wasn't. Are you trying to not use iPhones anymore? Because you said it's supposed to be
No, we still
okay
support
for phones.
iPhone.
Okay.
It's just that over time, we have to sunset support for old phones. So like very old phones or very old iPhone, like iOS
Got it.
12 or something. And that's just because at some point, Apple stops maintaining security updates for them, or like we build something new that's only really available on this set of phones. And so in that scenario, like we just sunset support for the really old stuff, and we just support the things that have been made for the last, 8 years or something like that.
Then on the inheritance side, it is only one person who can be the inheritor. It is not possible to split it into two people who get the inheritance.
So
And then the idea of like, then I think like, what if you want to make sure that they don't get it until they're age 21 or age 30? Like maybe there it's important. And then I wanted to ask you about the Lend partnership that you have, just because I think that's also super interesting.
Yeah. So right now, for most of our plans, you can only have one beneficiary. We do have, for our private clients, which is our top plan, you can have two. And it's because we handle the inheritance a little bit differently. It's much more manual at that level. So whereas everything else has this kind of timer-based setup, for our private clients who are often securing a lot of Bitcoin, we do more of a manual check of like, we actually go verify the death certificate. We've collected information ahead of time on who their beneficiaries are. And so we know more about them, basically, if they opt into doing that. And so that allows us to have a secondary beneficiary, like just in case a husband and wife go down in a plane crash or something, then we can work with the third person or something. But we know that it's a request to be able to have backup beneficiaries. Like it's a thing that we get asked about a lot. So well, in that scenario,
you don't want to have to choose a favorite, right? Yeah.
Yes, you just have to decide which one you like better. But in that scenario too, what we'll often run into is people will kind of be choosing like an executor for their estate anyway. It's not like your two kids are both, hopefully they're not fighting over your estate. It's like you have an executor who says, here, I'm controlling the assets after you pass away and making sure that it gets distributed to the two kids properly. And so what people will do is they'll make the executor the recipient, because we don't actually call it a beneficiary in the legal sense. We call it a recipient. You're receiving the keys. So you make the executor the recipient, and then they will have the Bitcoin, and they'll distribute it according to your will and trust. And so that's the thing, I think, on that kind of whole last part of your question is basically, we don't try to cover every situation in software. We lean on the legal system to properly distribute your assets. And then it's just like making sure that the assets are recoverable and can be distributed by the person who's in charge of doing that.
Great response.
Time
Daniel.
for a couple more.
Yeah.
Yeah, so very quickly, so what happens if, hopefully it will never happen, but if Casa goes bankrupt?
Yeah, so this is one of the best parts about using Casa, and we get asked this all the time. And this is where holding your own keys is the most beneficial thing you can do with Bitcoin, because if Casa goes bankrupt or our infrastructure totally blows up, and even if we're not bankrupt, you just can't even use the product, you can just take your keys, go plug them into Sparrow, and there's your Bitcoin.
Another multi-sig, another wallet that enables multi-sig. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Any other
Sparrow
wallet.
is like an open source multi-sig wallet, and it doesn't look as pretty as Casa. It's not as easy to use as Casa, but like we've written a blog post that says, here's how you recover your wallet into Sparrow step by step. And for clients who want it, like we actually will help you set it up now. And so then, because then you can actually be verifying everything that we do. Like anytime you go in to receive Bitcoin in Casa, you can also hit receive in Sparrow and see the exact same Bitcoin address in both places. And so that's the huge benefit of holding your own keys in the right way, is you can do sovereign recovery is what we call it, and that lets you recover the assets to another wallet in case something ever happens to us. We always say we're removing all the single points of failure around your Bitcoin, and that includes us.
Appreciate it. Did you have, was there
So-
someone else?
Something of a more slightly technical question. I had heard a podcast with Jameson talking about going seedless, which I guess means destroying. Let's say you've got a 3 of 5, and you've got 3 hardware wallets. So destroying the keys for 2 of the wallets. Do you still recommend that? Is that something that? Can you just maybe explain the pros and cons of doing that?
Yeah, so we've actually walked this back over the years. The original reason why we said go seedless is because most people don't really know how to protect a seed phrase. And so you're kind of like keeping this piece of paper in your sock drawer or something, like hope nobody finds it. And we figured it's better to have a hardware wallet that has a pin on it and is protecting against your protecting that private key. And then what we found in practice over like years of doing this is that hardware wallets will break unexpectedly. People will forget the pins to their hardware wallets. And so then you end up in these scenarios that are scarier than they should be. You don't lose the Bitcoin, but you just end up in a scenario maybe where are freakier than they should be. And we found out that, actually, it's a little bit better to just keep a couple of seed phrases to give you that resilience. And so we've changed our recommendation on that over the years. So that was like an interesting learning, and luckily it didn't result in people losing any Bitcoin, but it is something that we've changed.
Very cool. I think there's one other question here. We'll do one more, I think, and then we'll wrap it up. Yeah.
Going to make
2
this
more.
quick again, as fast as I could do. When you talked about the inheritance and scanning the QR code for the person who's getting the inheritance off the originator's phone, is that a handshake where, because they both have apps, it's sending it from the network from one phone over the course of your network to the other person's phone? Or is it actually like the seed phrase, the encryption is in the QR code and it's literally copying from that?
Yeah, the encrypted seed phrase is in the QR code.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And the second thing is a lot of the services I personally use and trust, which are very few, I like them because they know inevitably that they're going to get hacked if they're out for a while and successful. So what I like about them is they're like if crap goes down, here's how you're all notified. This is what we do behind the scenes and stuff. Because I haven't looked it up, do you have like a whole process disclosure for your clients just in case that happens?
So we don't have like a canary or anything like that, but that's more actually on the legal side, like a warrant canary or something. So maybe that's not as relevant. We have processes that are basically like, in the case of, bad security incident, here's how we would communicate with our customers kind of thing. But we don't, it's not like, I guess it's not something that we've like gamed out where we've like had to run this before kind of thing, because we haven't been hacked. But
Good question. Did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, just quick yes or no question. Do you guys have a bug bounty program just in case people find flaws with the software or your network services?
yeah, we do have a bug bounty program. It's not the best, honestly. It's okay. What we used to have a more robust bug bounty program, and what we found was we just got a lot of like drive-by stuff that was not a real thing. And then you spend a lot of time like investigating and responding, and it turns out this was not a vulnerability. And so there's actually people that like make their living trying to just scan a ton of different websites with some basic tools and then try to get bug bounties off of it. And so we kind of took out some of that stuff because it was just more of a time suck than anything. But we still do have an email on our site. I think it's probably like security@team.casa or something like that, where people can email if they find something that's like a real issue.
Was there one other question in the back, or are we good? I think we'll leave it there. Nick, thank you so much for your time. Thank you all you guys for coming out. Yeah, a real round of applause. And yeah, we'll be keeping our eyes on what happens with the SBR and everybody who's sort of on the fence about using Casa. Hopefully this was enough motivation for you to get off that fence and to make the right decision, if you will. So we will leave it there. Have a nice evening, everybody. Thank you guys for joining.
Thanks.